Carolyn Yoder, executive editor of Calkins Creek Books, and it's my extreme honor to be talking with Gail Jarrow, author extraordinaire of many Calkins Creek titles. So we thought we'd start out with a little background to how we came to know each other and work together. And Gail has a better handle on that. So Gail, how did we meet and how did we start working together?
It was a long time ago, Carolyn.
It was.
22, I looked it up. It was 22 years ago. You were history editor at Highlights Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
I had been writing science articles for the magazine, and I happened to write one that had a bit of history in it, and the science editor sent it to you to double check me.
Mm-hmm.
And that was our first encounter. And then after that, I sent you some more history articles, strictly history, which you bought, and they ended up being published. So I'd say that was the very beginning. But then you started Calkins Creek, and I wanted to get to be part of that. So I sent you an idea for what turned out to be the Printer's Trial, which was about the John Peter Zenger Freedom of the Press trial in 1735. That was
one of the first books we ever published at Calkins Creek. Well, so it seems like your background is science and history, and you used to write fiction, novels, and now you seem to be devoted to nonfiction. So why nonfiction and why the passion for that genre?
I think there's a few things, if I self-analyze, I'm a really curious person. I like to learn. I mean, I was one of these kids that really liked school.
Mm-hmm.
I like learning new things. I get challenged if it's hard to learn. And then once I learn it, and this is the other side of me, I enjoy sharing it. Mm-hmm. And that other side of me became a teacher for a while. I was a science teacher. So writing is a combination of being able to learn a lot of things that I didn't know before, and then sharing it with kids. I used to teach middle school, and I like that age group because I think kids are very much coming alive intellectually, and I really want to contribute to what they learn about the world. There's a lot to know, a lot to understand, and there's really no limit to what a writer can bring to that. And I think that's why I enjoy the nonfiction. And as you mentioned, I used to write some novels. I have several novels published. So that, I think, is why I like the narrative nonfiction style. It brings that piece of me that likes fiction into nonfiction, although nothing I write in nonfiction is made up. But it's just the style of writing.
Yeah, and it's come a long way. And your interests, which I've shared a lot of time for the theater and New York and dining, etc., shows like a varied background. And you've done like biography, and you've done books on magicians, etc. And as you said, the Printer's Trial. But a few years ago, or maybe more than a few, you started a trilogy for Calkins Creek on deadly diseases. The first one, not so well known, which was pellagra in the book Red Madness. And the second one was on typhoid fever in Typhoid Mary, Fatal Fever. And the third one was on bubonic plague called Bubonic Panic. So because of your background, because of your interest in, science, and you were a science teacher and you majored in zoology, I believe, at Duke University, sort of what sparked that beginning of the trilogy and your interest in that field? Because that sort of has carried on.
I think It is because it's a combination of my background in biology and my interest in history. They come together in a way that I really enjoy. And face it, if you're going to write a book that requires a lot of research and writing, and it's going to take well over a year to do, you better enjoy it. So that's why I think I've gravitated in that way. But also, all these books are about the period from the middle of the 19th century to the present. It was an enormous time of medical advancement. I mean, it really was a revolution. Mm. If you look at the way medicine was at the time of the Civil War, and then the way it was by the time of World War II, just so many things that happened, and so much knowledge was gained, and the world changed, and the way we're living is different because of that. So I think it's so exciting. And it's also a period a lot of people don't know much about.
And also it has relevance to today. And so all these books, unfortunately, have a relevance to what we are going through with the pandemic. And as a result, we are issuing Fatal Fever in paperback with a new chapter on COVID. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about how these might be history books, but they have so much relevance to kids today.
Well, a key part of Fatal Fever is the discussion of how typhoid fever was transmitted. And it's about Typhoid Mary, and she transmitted this disease on her hands because she didn't wash her hands after using the bathroom, and she was a cook. So she killed people. So the book really talks about how at the beginning of the 1900s, when this story takes place, there was this new awareness of sanitation and how important it was to be clean. And by being clean, you don't transmit germs. Now here we are with COVID-19. Now I'm always, I'm like this. I mean, I've always washed my hands. I'm really careful.
You are diligent.
Yeah, I'm very diligent. Partly it's the research I've done, but I've just always been like that. But a lot of people weren't. So COVID, suddenly people are aware that, oh, gee, we can spread this respiratory disease by our hands, by just breathing and coughing and sneezing on each other. So we have come around to a place that we actually were before, but people forget. Yeah. But the thing about COVID that I have found very relevant to the books I've written is that in every one of these books, I've shown that there's been great medical progress that has come out of terrible epidemics, like bubonic plague, for example, or the pellagra epidemic in the South, which I talk about in Red Madness. Millions of people were affected. We don't even know about it today. Why don't we know about it today? Because great medical progress occurred. And with COVID, the same thing has happened. There have been missteps. Nobody was really sure at first how to handle it, how to treat it. But meanwhile, vaccines were being developed. And not just one vaccine, several vaccines.
Yeah.
And less than a year after COVID was recognized, we had vaccines. Normally, vaccines take 10 years to develop. So what a remarkable piece of progress. And, I've been reading about how these vaccine companies are now talking about how they're going to use the technology to go forward and make other vaccines for other diseases.
Yeah.
So it's a hope. It's a hopeful thing that comes out of horrible medical crises.
Deadly diseases with hope in the background.
Always hope. I'm writing for kids, and I personally think that we need to be giving young people hope.
Yeah,
about their future.
I totally agree. But then um, after the deadly diseases, you took a sort of sidestep in a way and sort of went into a book on science fiction, which won you the Cybert Honor Medal, Spooked. And talk a little bit about that, how that was, what really sparked your interest in that, and maybe you were had enough of deadly diseases and said, "Hey, I want to do something new." But what really drew you to that story of the War of the Worlds?
It's not quite as weird as it sounds, because in doing all the research I did about medical problems, and also just my whole background in science,
Mhm.
I realized the dangers that come when people don't ask questions and aren't skeptical. And it also dovetails for just the way our world is now, and particularly social media and news, the way people absorb news.
Mhm.
I realized the combination of all those problems um, and the science aspect, we need to have more critical thinking, and it's certainly a skill young people need. So that made me want to look for a story from history that demonstrated what could happen, what had happened
Mhm.
when people didn't think critically.
Mhm.
But I don't want to be preachy about things, so I was looking for something that would be very entertaining,
Mhm.
but a good story from history. And I followed, I decided to do, after looking at a lot of stories, the Orson Welles radio broadcast in 1938 about the War of the Worlds. He did not intend it to be a hoax. It was strictly a radio drama for a regular radio program, where he and his actors took a famous story or novel and made it into a 1 hour drama. And they decided on H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, which was Martians invading London. But they changed it and they made it Martians invading New Jersey. And the actors and the writing were so good that there were people that believed it and panicked and got very upset, thinking this was the end of everything, the end of the world. So the book is about that, how they came up with this, how they made this radio drama, the techniques they used, but it's also about how people reacted to it and how some people didn't react out of fear. They knew what was going on. And then when they heard that other people got upset, they thought that was awful and they reacted to that. So it just turned out to be really an interesting piece of history, not really so removed from the way I've been thinking about science. And I had a lot of fun doing it.
And it's not so, and again, it's relevant to today. And it led really to your next book, Poison Eaters, which was also about um, belief and what people took for gospel about the food or the foods we eat. So talk a little bit about Poison Eaters.
Now, this book, it turns out, is extremely relevant today because it's about the FDA. And it talks about the beginning of the FDA, why we have an FDA, and mostly about one man who, Harvey Wiley, who way back in the late 1800s was a chemist and a doctor, became very upset about the drugs and the food additives that people were taking in ignorantly. They didn't know, they had no way to know. And he wanted to do something about it. And he just pushed forward for almost 40 years of the last part of his life to have this happen. And he succeeded, and we ended up with a Food and Drug Act and the formation of the FDA, which has evolved and grown quite a bit. They now have a lot of responsibilities, and all these vaccines have had to go through the FDA. And I think the story has become more relevant than I thought it
I
would.
know it's true. It's true. It's just so interesting that when I think kids study history, they don't make those connections to today so much, or in the class, maybe in the classroom more and more. But when they read your books, they can make those connections. And actually, you make those connections in the back matter sometimes of your books. Um,
Well, I try to make the connection because it we do tend to forget as a society how we got where we are from where we were. I, a lot of the things that have happened medically, including in the poison eaters and including in fatal fever, these were things that happened not that long ago.
right.
I knew people that lived through that period,
Mhm.
and I, I'm older, but um, I was one of the first group of children to start getting vaccines
I
and
remember.
antibiotics.
Yep.
So much has happened, and it's not in the distant past. I think it helps young people to know that that is the case.
Yeah. And I think today with the pandemic, kids are seeing how medicine is evolving. I think that's part of the dialogue of today. So after Spooked and Poison Eaters, you kind of return somewhat to not not deadly diseases, but to medical mishaps or fiascos. So that's your new series, which I'm so excited about. And we started with Blood and Germs, and then we're going into Ambushed. Um, so again, what led you to sort of come to this new series idea, which there will be 3 books in the series?
This Blood and Germs is about Civil War medicine. In the course of the research I've done for my other books, I've read a lot about the Civil War medical situation and how it was considered the beginning of a transition into more modern thinking about medicine. Also, I wrote a book called Lincoln's Flying Spies, published by Calkins Creek. That was about the Civil War too. And in doing the research for that book, I read a lot about diseases and the wounds that the Civil War soldiers endured. So it seemed natural to me to start to research this. I knew a lot about the medical conditions, but there was so much more to learn. I thought it was an interesting subject, and I really had fun doing the book. Civil War has always interested me anyway. I grew up not so far from Gettysburg, so from elementary school on, I visited Gettysburg, just had this sense of what the Civil War was like. Plus, again, there were ancestors of mine, not that far back, that participated in the war. So all of that came together, and I wanted to write about medical fiascos, terrible things that had happened. But yet, as I mentioned, there's always hope. There's things that come out of these fiascos that are positive. The Civil War was, without doubt, a medical fiasco. We don't know exactly, it's an estimate, but from 620 to 750,000 men died. Two-thirds of them died not of wounds on the battlefield, but of disease, which is a big number, a surprise to me when I learned that. And that just took me into the subject, and I wanted to show what happened, how the doctors at the time dealt with it, and then at the other end, what was positive. And for one thing, the medical profession was not great before the war. Medical education wasn't very good. So these doctors went into the war to be surgeons, and they had to learn on the fly a lot of techniques. And when the war was over, they went back into their communities and they knew much more about diseases and how to treat them. They knew about surgery. They were much more educated. And then another part of it was that there was this huge need for nursing care. And women stepped up. And after the war, nursing became a profession that women could go into, and it was acceptable for women to go into it. So that was a big deal. And then there are just little things like triage, which we take for granted. Well, that started in the United States during the Civil War.
One of the beautiful things in the book, or that you do so well, is use primary sources. They're woven into the narrative, so they're almost seamless. So I was particularly drawn to the one story of the soldier who was sort of left for dead. Maybe you can share that.
Yeah. Here's the page.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one of the parts of triage is that when somebody was wounded, the field hospital would decide, are they worth saving or not? And if they were not worth saving, they were set aside. And this guy, 19 years old, was shot in the chest. And you can see in this photograph where the bullet went in. Well, the thing about it was that chest wounds were not operable in the 1860s. So it was assumed that he was going to die. And they set him aside outside the field hospital. But he wasn't dead. And when it started to get cold that evening, he begged for somebody to take him inside where it was warmer. And when the attendant took him in, a doctor came by and looked at him again and realized that it was a flesh wound, that the bullet really hadn't gone into his chest. And the doctor just made a little slit with a scalpel and out popped the bullet. And the guy lived. And I was so intrigued by that I went through the census records and the military records to find out what happened to him. And he lived into his 90s and had a wonderful, successful life.
Such a nice story. Yeah. And your work on the Civil War and all that research that you did was played a big part in your next book, in the Medical Fiasco, which we're just finishing up on, called Ambushed, about President Garfield. And it deals with Civil War doctors and sort of their mindset during that time.
Well, when I was writing this, so Blood and Germs, I did realize that it was a transition period. The Civil War was. I have a set of American Heritage magazines, hardbound, that were my mother's. And I'm talking, these are from decades ago. But I go through them. And one day I saw an article about James Garfield's assassination. It was pretty interesting to me because Garfield, I think it's safe to say, is one of the least known presidents. He was the 20th president. He was elected in 1880, but he only served for 200 days. And 80 of those, he was in bed. So that got me interested in reading more about it. And as I got more into it, I discovered that Garfield's doctors had been Civil War surgeons. And they were well known and respected for being experts on gunshot wounds. And that's why they were called in to take care of Garfield. But the problem was that they had not advanced from the time of the 1860s. And in that period to the 1881, when Garfield was shot, there had been great progress made in Europe and in understanding about antiseptic surgery and treatment of wounds. And it was all tied into the germ theory, which was new. we take it for granted now that bacteria, that microbes cause infections, and disease. But that was the new idea then. Mm. Garfield surgeons were not ready to accept those ideas. Therefore, they didn't really treat Garfield the way they should have. And he died of extreme infection. Many doctors at the time thought that his care was bad, and they were critical of it. And it became a turning point, really, in medical history, because Garfield's struggle and trying to survive his gunshot wound lasted throughout a whole summer. And it was in the press every day. Mm-hmm. People would get up each morning, grab their papers to find out whether their president was still alive. And that was the only way people got news, was newspapers and weekly magazines. Because the public was so involved in that, when Garfield, spoiler alert, died, the public came to understand that he died from bad medical care, from bacterial infection. And it raised the understanding and awareness of germ theory among any doctors that were not convinced yet, and certainly among the public viewers of the situation. I think it really propelled the American medical community into the 20th century. They had been lagging behind Europe. This really did it. And think about all the people whose lives were saved because of this realization that bacteria was a problem.
Yeah. And so that book will be coming out very shortly, which we're all looking forward to. And the two of us are looking forward to finishing it up. And then we go to your third book in the Medical Fiasco, which I'll leave as a sort of lure to the listeners of what that might be. It's something totally, totally different. But again, thank you so much, Gail, for talking to us. You're a joy to work with.
Ditto, Carolyn.
A pleasure to know. And we look forward to your next book. So thank you again.